Exceptional Randos show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Bass Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Wow, that was random. Exceptional Radio.
Hey, good afternoon. It's Sunday, the 5th of July. I hope everybody had a wonderful gunpowder detonation evening experience. My neighbors had, they put on quite the show It started around 8 o'clock and went on just a little bit past midnight. I think they had like a couple trunk loads full of mortars because it was unending. And, it also meant that I didn't have to go anywhere to watch people blow shit up. But on that
I
note,
worked yesterday because all holidays matter.
I think it's important to point out that the Declaration of Independence wasn't signed until August. It wasn't signed for like a month later. So, it's nice that they want to commemorate the agreement on the article, but our history is, as we've been pointing out for the past couple of weeks, is fairly inaccurate. Just a little bit inaccurate.
They try to make it too black and white. It's attempting to be too cut and dry about, as if there's no such thing as first drafts.
Well, I'm pretty sure that most people don't realize that we're on it's like the third constitution we're on right now. And then one that everyone wants to believe is the model for all of or every nation's constitution is actually modeled after the French Constitution. Mm-hmm. So there's some pretty big historical gaps, but we've been we're working to dismantle those ideas. So on a unrelated note to the history of this country, or I guess it's future history of this country, Florida's at like day 3 or 4 or whatever of over 10,000 cases. They're quickly approaching 200,000 cases. Their ICUs are freaking out. ICUs across the country are freaking out because, containment was supposed to get all this stuff under wraps, and it really hasn't. Today, Daniel shared with us a very, very interesting image, and I'm going to throw that into the slideshow here in a little bit. But what it amounts to is there is a correlation with credit card spending at restaurants and all of the cities that have had spikes. And this isn't just like pulling numbers out of thin air. It's very real. We're seeing a lot of information here that's I guess people can argue with it as much as they want, but
we also think about the risk meters that are being shared by various agencies and various government guidance promulgators. And going out to an open air or a sit down restaurant is like a moderate risk. And people are using their credit cards. So not only are they going into more debt in order to replicate or try and chase the nostalgia of the consumer economy, they are literally doing that and exposing themselves in a metric-based fashion, or in a way that can be in a measurable fashion to coronavirus, and they're exposing others too. Because if going to a sit-down restaurant and using a credit card for such transactions or a debit card for such transactions didn't end up with a correlation to increased COVID-19 diagnosis, then that would also indicate that people would be following, or that the containment efforts for such situations or scenarios were actually working. And what this indicates is that either what people are doing in the restaurants isn't following the rules or isn't following the guidances for safety in a space like that, or if somebody is in a state where sit-down indoor dining is allowed, those types of protections aren't working and people are getting infected. It could be the people who are working there and not necessarily spending their money there, but are spending all day there. The people in the kitchens, the people who are going back and forth to all these tables where people are, we see them, we see the images. And if there were no people who are wearing their masks around their chins or wearing them, hanging off the side of their ear in in a space where there are other people sitting literally within 6 feet of you, there wouldn't have to be a series of reminders or memes making fun of it, because it's, memes are a reflection of cultural phenomenon and can at times be a parody, but they're also, a sociological reflection in some respects. And also, if there wouldn't be so many articles saying wear your mask, there wouldn't be all of these states all of a sudden mandating the wearing of a mask. There wouldn't be all of these local governments adopting these resolutions saying, okay, well, obviously what we were doing before wasn't working, and when we opened up too early, everybody started getting infected, our numbers started to go up, and we should all be wearing masks. So clearly there's something that's not working, and once people start spending money, we're seeing where they're spending their money, and they're spending their money in a public health risk way.
This is correlated.
It's not even their money. You pointed out something that I didn't even realize in the context of that graphic. It's not even their money; it's credit. So you're talking about people who are going into debt to risk dying for the sake of going back to the way it was before COVID. And that's the risk and self-delusion involved with that mindset is so damning.
Future labor.
Absolutely.
Future labor. They're willing to promise future labor for the risk of going out to eat someplace. And
or they're willing to miss a house payment to just go out and sit down for dinner.
I see all these images of people going out to just being out, and they're kind of wearing their mask, but their nose is exposed. Or even when I go to the store, I see people walking around with their mask just on their chin. That's not wearing a mask. That's covering your chin, potentially exposing the part of your body that's been exposed to the inside of the mask that goes on your face, theoretically.
This is crazy. I thinking about it. I've gotten delivery, which was contactless, and I've gotten a drive-through with my mask on, and in the process, they put the money or card in a container, and you didn't even hand it directly to them. I haven't gone out to eat this entire year. I can't think of one time I've actually gone out to eat, and I don't want to fucking die.
Bro, you know how to cook, though. I mean, I can verify that you know how to cook.
That's true, but even in that, it's like none of my friends have been stupid enough to be like, hey, let's go out to eat. And me have to even deny like that meetup because none of my friends want to die either.
God, it's just.
I've had a couple of people stop by and hang out, and we've ended up like, the people. It's funny because the people that have come over before they even came over, they were like, "Do you want me to wear a mask?" Like, I'm like, well, where have you been? And we're like going over each other's like, we're doing contact tracing each other, and then being like, well, it's you haven't been that many places, I haven't been that many places. It'd be ridiculous for us to wear a mask, like in the proximity if we're gonna hang out for like 2 hours. Yeah. But we went through this whole thing where we're checking each other's like histories of where we're gone because we're not fucking idiots. And then that it's not even I've been so happy that my friends are like trying to respect my space, even asking if they want if I want them to wear a mask. But it's like at a certain point there is an element of you can't if you're gonna be in a proximity with somebody for 2 hours, a mask isn't necessarily going to like work past that 2 hours. So there's like, if you're hanging out with somebody, it feels almost kind of pointless because you're gonna be exposed anyway. Not to say, but then I was at another friend's house and we were like, oh, there's kids around. We gotta wear masks in front of the kids so they don't think that it's not okay or think that it's okay not to wear a mask. So there's this element of like, on the one hand, in your personal space, you can take calculated risks. But then you have to think about kids if you have kids around where it's not all about just protecting yourself in that. And there's all these elements where some people take these things into account, and then the other side just does not even fucking care. And that's where I'm like, I don't want to have to uh like I don't want to negotiate with people on the other side. I don't even want to talk to those people. The people that don't care and are willing to go out in public and not wear masks, and then aren't even willing to consider the implications of not wearing masks in front of their own kids. I don't want to be around those people in public or in private. And that's where there's an element of adults. I If I'm not getting paid to teach them, I don't want to have to be training adults in my free time. That's not how I want to spend my free time. If somebody doesn't want to learn to wear a mask, I'm not going to be the person to fucking train them unless somebody pays me for it at this point in my life.
Yeah, when I went out to the store last Friday night at like 9:30 because I missed my midday window, there were, I'm going to say, a dozen people in Kroger, and other than the employees who were all masked, I'm pretty sure I was the only one wearing a mask. And it was just kind of unnerving. I mean, I get it. There's no one out. People think that it's safe because the population density is really, really low at that point, or the in-store density is really low. But it's
Dude, it doesn't matter
I
at
know.
the time.
I know, that's the scariest part.
It's like a cultural thing that I've noticed between there's Kroger and Aldi and Target. Yeah. Kroger people don't wear masks, but people at Aldi and Target do.
Yeah.
It's insane, the dichotomy.
I found I went for two things really, but I ended up getting a lot more. But I went for concentrated juice because that's my jam. And then I also went to get some paper towels because I was running low. And lo and behold, there were no paper towels, leading up to the big weekend. And there was plenty of toilet paper for the first time. It was the first time I've been there after noon and seen toilet paper at Kroger. And then, of course, I'm wandering around. It's like maybe they've got some paper towels somewhere in the back, because they do that sometimes when they have overflow. And I didn't find anything. And then on my way out, I noticed there was this box on top of another stack of boxes, and it was the paper towels, and it was unopened. And so, I look around thinking like maybe there's somebody who can help me, because I shouldn't be climbing on boxes of stuff to get a box that's probably too high for OSHA standards anyways. And I open this thing up and I pull out a fresh container of paper towels, and I think to myself, I'm the first person that's touched this thing since it was boxed. That was a really surreal sensation. That was a strange feeling to think I'm the first person to touch this thing since it was sent out for post-processing.
You see, you're thinking about things like that, and the people who aren't wearing their masks in public, or the people who are contending that the people that other people are vectors for spreading the virus, even though they're wearing masks, or that wearing masks doesn't matter, and also the people who apparently need to be educated or trained on why wearing a mask is so important by this point, are a large part of the population, it seems, and they're making a lot of decisions that are highlighting their presence and apparently their influence on public health, public safety, and even politics to a certain degree.
Yeah, we know that it's people who went out to restaurants and bars. We know it's people not wearing masks. We know this because the protest zones haven't had huge COVID spikes. They just haven't. The numbers don't correlate to the spike states. And then, and on top of that, we can see through cell phone location telemetry that those large groups of people who are masked haven't ended up with COVID. And even more importantly, the ICU numbers are just rising like rapidly. And I know that there's an argument that with more comprehensive testing and faster testing and better data, the numbers are going to rise, but it's pretty much the same. But it's not, because the ICU beds are filling up, and that wasn't happening before. There's definitely a lot of data, and it's getting thicker and more difficult for some people to read, I believe, because we're just getting more and more data. There are more people who are chiming in. There are more agencies. Holy crap! Hydroxychloroquine. CNN did another article about how a new study says that it's helping people recover more quickly, but only if they get it like early on, like right at the moment that they realize that they've got a problem. So now they're backtracking. So it's hard to say. The media is just running with whatever they've got, and this is that whole. And we've discussed this to infinitum. The culture of first within journalism is eroding the trust of the audience. It's gotta be there first, so we can get the most views, so we can get more ad revenue and clicks.
What's interesting is that the culture of first in media was really brought to the fore of the consumer economy with the creation of CNN by Ted Turner, because Ted Turner wanted a 24/7 news broadcasting source for people to just tune into at any time. And because CNN ended up being the first on location for several significant events within the adult lifespans of news consumers during various presidencies, they ended up building a lot of trust and credibility because they were the people who were there first and had the first opinion and were considered to be the most reliable simply because they were there first. But it was actually a vehicle to essentially create a self-sustaining capital generator, because the companies that or the local broadcasting companies, or even actually the sports teams in, I believe, Georgia, were all a lot of them were purchased by Ted Turner, so that way he could have the opportunity to broadcast their events specifically on the networks that his organization had control over and owned. So if you could control the advertising, and people pay for ad space by the millions, and now we see how much ad space is taken up by CNN, but even by Fox News as well, and all the other major media organizations that claim to be either left-leaning or right-leaning. But yeah, the culture of we are here first sort of eclipses the credibility or the reliability of the news itself. And if people are only paying attention to what they think is reporting it first without actually looking for a thoughtful, non-biased analysis, oftentimes what they come out with is something that confirms what they thought of in the first place, or something that makes them just feel comfortable.
So the Turner Broadcast Network, that company has a portfolio of unrivaled cable television news and entertainment brands and businesses, and it includes CNN, CNN Headline News, CNN International, TNT, TBS, Cartoon Network, Turner Classic Movies. The list goes on. They own a significant portion of the visual media that's presented to people through cable, through satellites, through terrestrial broadcasts. They're pretty huge, and that's not to say they're the only one. Fox is also huge, but good.
Ted Turner's influence is like so far-reaching that he's been able to effectively remove himself from media in the past 7 years, because they used to lampoon him on SNL a lot, but even that is kind of faded out because not enough people are familiar with him, because he's done well enough to remove himself from mainstream consciousness. He's like back in the shadows where he wanted to be in the first place.
He's been at it since the 70s.
Oh yeah,
So,
I mean, I think 60s, right?
No, it's at least on Wikipedia, it's the history starts in the 70s. I guess there's an early history
I think
section.
it's even earlier, to be honest, because it's like Wikipedia
Yeah.
obviously he's trying to give a. I think he was
Oh,
working
no,
in
no.
media.
Turner Broadcasting Systems formally incorporated in May of 1965.
Yeah, yeah. See,
Yeah.
there you go.
So,
That's
but
what I was
it's not
like.
like till the 70s till they start really purchasing up a lot of other
Well,
stations
because
and
they
start
hadn't developed
rebranding.
that culture yet,
Yeah.
and that's where it starts to play out in
Yeah.
a way where this is where Anchorman's so amazing at sort of filling in the gaps of history that people don't even realize that period of history is kind of real. Even in the way they presented it, it's a real period in history where women were just compartmentalized to covering bullshit stories like cat fashion shows, even when they, were real journalists. And that's it's absurd enough to make into a comedy, and that's why it worked as a comedy. But in that, the Ted Turner, they start elaborating, or they start showing how he started consolidating news networks to follow bullshit news like police chases and stuff like that,
Yeah.
where all of America would be focused on a police chase in one area, and then it would end, and then you know, what's the next story? And that culture, Anchorman was really good about showing how that came about, but I think the point is kind of lost on Americans.
The point is lost on Americans because people aren't really meant to know the history of the organization. Um, Ted Turner, like you've said, he's more or less disappeared or vanished from public discourse, and I think that was most likely by design. I agree, and news organizations, or at least large news organizations, are concerned predominantly with their image and their perception by the public, which they take a long time to um, curate and manicure and revise. And they just look for opportunities to consistently keep people focused on what's happening now, or rather what they choose to show them, and to inundate people with the opinions of a specific subset of a commentary population. So in that sense, people aren't saying, "Oh, what's the history of CNN?" They're not looking at the primary sources, like we've talked about. It's a matter of critical thinking, and it has to do with the indoctrination aspect of the American educational system, where it basically teaches people to simply accept what is being given to them in the moment and not necessarily look forward. You have people who aren't really looking to history in order to determine what may be coming next. And CNN isn't, the only mass media organization, and the Fox News isn't the only mass media organization with the kinds of directives and intentions and large scale broadcasting and influential type movements that can even lead to influencing political, like large scale political events. And that's why elections are so popularly followed. I think that's one of the reasons why elections are so popularly followed, is because it's treated like almost like a sports event by the media, and people are divided, or people are essentially taught to say, okay, this is what my trusted news source is saying, so this is what I should be thinking, instead of why is my news source, or why is the news source that I tend to look at or take information from on a more regular basis saying these things, where is it drawing its information from, and why is it sharing these messages with me?
I think that's a question, well, a set of questions that a lot of people don't ask in general, on either side, and that's kind of where it does perpetuate that split team approach to politics and media, because the media perpetuates that divide by, we have the perceived left and perceived right, and they just lean into it in a way where, you would think if they were supposed to be doing their jobs that they would actually not be perpetuating these concepts or paradigms, but it's in their best interest to serve a specific demographic, and they know that. Um, you don't see Trump advertisements on MSNBC in the same way you do on Fox News, and that's kind of where again um, these audiences have a specific need that the networks are willing to uh, just feed into and turn into an echo chamber, and then bring on people like Candace Owen to have pseudo diversity.
That's not even really diversity, though. I don't think a party line can't be diversity. The party line is the whole point of the party line is to tell people what to think, to tell people what to believe, to tell people what's important. That's like the opposite of diversity. There's no diverse opinion when it's agreed upon at the highest level. It might as well they should stop pretending that they're trying to have diverse opinions. I feel like the only room for that kind of reporting or journalism to exist is in a pure editorial show like 60 Minutes or 2020, but I'm not even sure if those are even pure editorials anymore.
Yeah, I definitely don't think they're pure editorials, but
I think at one point they might have tried to be, but not anymore.
Yeah.
It's when so much of our world is delivered to us through a screen, it makes me wonder just how much of it is, how much of it is necessary. How far does it have to go before the virtual world becomes the actual world people completely interact in? And we've talked about virtual reality in the past, and I've been hearing more and more about it on talk radio. Like there's a piece about it the other day on NPR. They were talking about how in the past there have been programs to help people learn de-escalation techniques, where it would be a person looking at a screen making decisions, and there'd be a proctor or an administrator who could essentially press the buttons on the choose your own adventure to give them different scenarios. And they were talking about how there's a man on a bridge holding a baby, threatening to drop it, and the police officer has all these options. And in their example, the police officer draws his firearm and the man drops the baby, and then of course the police officer loses the scenario. They have to start over, and the idea of course is that they say, hey, I care about you, how can I help you, what's wrong, what can we do to fix this problem? And so now with virtual reality we have an option, we have the potential to create a learning environment which is more interactive, which can simulate to a much higher degree of accuracy the kind of environmental challenges that are presented with law enforcement, where they're standing there trying to de-escalate some scene in the middle of a city, and there is traffic noise, and there are people yelling at them because people like to yell at cops, and there's a pretty damn good reason for that at this point. But it's being framed in such a way that it's not easy to do your job when you're being yelled at. It's difficult to focus on what the task at hand, and so we're trying to be a little sympathetic to this. And then of course, when one officer is engaged with somebody who's freaking out about something and they're trying to get them to calm down, and another officer walks up and they don't know anything about the situation because they literally just got there, there's a very strong chance that they're going to make the wrong decision. And so you have a second or third or fourth officer approach somebody who's not right. There is the likelihood that something is going to go wrong, and they're going to do something that doesn't de-escalate the situation, that actually escalates it towards a physical encounter, is much higher. And so there's a way to do this. We have the option. I think you actually mentioned the name of the platform the other day, Chris. And I thought
it's called Survivor.
Yeah. So there's actually a platform that facilitates this kind of training, that gives people a more realistic experience something that they can draw from in the future. And I think that virtual reality presents a very interesting, a lot of potential. I'm actually getting ready to update my system to be VR capable, and I'm really excited to do this. We've talked about this in the past. Chris is already on the path of exploring virtual reality at a fairly high level as far as I'm concerned. And so I'm finally getting ready to do this. And in doing so, I read about all of these things that happen, like extreme motion sickness, actual vomiting as a result of dissociation, dissociation from what people are doing, because it becomes a video game to some people, and then they don't have problems doing the wrong thing. I think that's like a reflection of the GTA culture. Not that GTA is not a fun game. I've enjoyed playing GTA many times, but it's a game that requires that you essentially do the wrong thing.
Even then, GTA kind of started that culture, but then you moved into areas like Fable, where
Forgot about that
what
game.
was it, All Out,
Yeah.
where the people in the game would start to react and hear about your actions, whether good or bad. So if there's a game where you could kill kids in Fallout, and if you started killing kids, people would start hunting you down all across the game, and it's something that I didn't even find out about until reading an article about it, because I didn't even know it was an option. But apparently, some people were doing it where you're like, oh, just because this is a virtual world, it's okay to kill kids. But then, even then, the game doesn't let you get away with it and not have major repercussions, to the point where I think it literally turns everybody in the map against you, and you basically have to just spend the rest of the game being hunted for being a child killer. It's the craziest shit where
That's awesome.
they build these moral choices into the game, but they also build in the repercussions in many cases.
That's
where again,
fucking awesome.
it's not like even in GTA, the cops would come after you, and ultimately the military comes after you. So it's not like it's devoid of repercussions, but
GTA also rewards you if you get away. You get to keep the loot.
for sure.
You get to keep
That's
on
again
keeping
where,
on.
but that's in the American version, because when they released it in Australia, they wouldn't even. I think they took out the capacity for you to even kill a police officer in the game. So there's all this stuff about, games that get released in America don't necessarily get allowed to be released other places in the ways they're released here.
What's that say about our culture's thirst for violence? I mean,
Right.
how do we create education systems? Because that's what video games do. Like, I know that it seems really weird, but when people who are part of the Sony Gran Turismo Racing League, transitioned into real life, actual on track, behind the wheel of a car racing, they did better than veterans, because they were so skilled at operating the simulator that once they were behind the wheel of the real thing, which the simulator was based on, they just were incredible drivers. So we know that this stuff works. We know that training people for situations in a virtual environment can translate into a real life environment. There's got to be some kind of extra measure of oversight. It's almost like we've got a culture that has completely shunned the concept of oversight.
I mean, I think that's definitely part of the libertarian independence movement culture that doesn't want any oversight whatsoever. That culture definitely exists in America. But I think that culture has always existed in that this country is like an offshoot of Britain, that while Britain was trying well, not necessarily trying, I think Britain was evolving because it had existed as an empire for so long that eventually you have to move forward ethically, and the Americans didn't want to do that at the time. So that's kind of what this entire country is founded on: is yes, we want to keep slaves and we want to, you know, have our independence from a monarchy that happened to be moving forward ethically at the time. It's just weird how shit works out.
Yeah, I believe the slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s, and the only place where they sustained any kind of let's just call it ethically questionable activities was India. And they actually followed the American model for plantations. The American plantation model was applied to India for cotton and a variety of other products. So they may have moved forward in some places, but the last big colony that manufactured goods for the empire still sustained those practices. Meanwhile, Hong Kong turned into an economic trade center. So it's really weird. I think the British Empire is a very complex topic because it lasted for a really long time, and it's so ingrained in all of Western history and fundamental to Western history that it's hard to unpack a lot of those things because the record keeping was terrible.
Yeah, and there's also this sort of disconnect between Americans who don't realize that as a colony that it's we needed to learn British history to understand our history because we're part of that empire. We just don't see ourselves as that because that's part of the illusion that's created by the empire's shifting, and that's again where it's like, yeah, the British Empire didn't become ethical overnight, and it's still not ethical. It just shifted its tactics to banking and war profiteering. So in that, it's not even that. Yeah, it's not that they ever stopped doing unethical shit. It's that they just the most unethical shit. They started moving away from it.
Yeah.
And
then they created complex laws to allow them to engage in still unethical or burgeoning on unethical behaviors.
Well, because even then, it's like with the Indian population, they would like promise them citizenship at first if they did all the bullshit or served in the army or whatever.
Yeah.
And then after a while, they're like, "Whoops, we got too many Indians over here, so we're stopping that, but we're still gonna take your labor."
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of anti-Indian propaganda that came out of Britain at the time, where you see it now, and it's fucked up. Where obviously there's propaganda that comes from all over, but that's also why I think this gets back to the notion of why history should actually be really art history, because you can't really understand history without understanding the images and symbolism. And in that, we're seeing all this stuff with the eagle holding flags and shit like that is symbolism that is obviously a throwback to Nazis.
But that goes all the way back to the Roman Empire.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So,
but I mean, but they're trying to.
But the Nazis got it from the Roman Empire.
The Nazis stole a lot of shit from different people, even down to obviously the swastika is not something that the Nazis came up with.
Yeah.
But those people don't know that shit, and that's why again it's like the American military is using the swastika before the Nazis. But everybody, when they try to use like the Iron Cross and the eagle, they're not referencing Rome. They're referencing the fucking Nazis.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm getting at. Is they don't know about Rome. Those people specifically don't know that history.
Yeah. Roman history lasted a long time. A lot of the British Empire is based off of Roman doctrine. Even to this day, road widths in England and by extension in America were decided, thousands or 1,500 years ago, because that was the width of the Roman cart, of the chariot, and that's decided how big our lanes are this entire time. And that's crazy to me. Like, how do we bridge that much history? Even let's say we do find a way to impose upon education, the education system, the necessity of being able to reflect on cultural iconography and imagery. In relation, so they can study the cultural context. But how do we bridge that kind of gap where, a decision was made over 1,000 years ago, so far ago that it's probably not even part of a family's oral tradition?
The right sources need to be presented with the information, and I know using terms like right and wrong source can be a bit of a slippery slope fallacy. But part of doing historical research is the search for a primary source. And if the instruction of history, if the teaching of history, and then including art is to include art history, then that's a step away from indoctrination, because there's going to have to be analysis of the reasons and the rationale behind the choice of the iconography and the imagery and the art and the artistic choices and the motivations behind producing different types of imagery at various points in history. But there needs to be an examination of the historical reference to tie it into the present day. Otherwise, people are just going to most likely ignore it, or or it'll just come across as another form of indoctrination, basically saying, well, these roads are just this wide and that's the way it is, as opposed to saying this is the historical document that indicates the length or the width of an ancient Roman chariot, and a majority of the roads that were built in this part of the Roman Empire, which is now known as the United Kingdom, were built at this width, and it was in order to accommodate this particular technology. And these roads were then paved over. These roads were expanded or turned into interconnected routes that still persist today, or can still be followed today. And subsequently, you have a continuation of that width in order to. I suppose it would have to be a cultural discussion as well. It wouldn't just be a matter of, this is why. Why hasn't it changed? Again, like, why hasn't it changed in order to accommodate the width of a car? Does the width of a car have a correlation to the width of a road? Which came first, right? Are cars being built to the roads that were built to accommodate chariots, or are roads now being modified or built from their original construction in order to accommodate new types of vehicles?
Well, the materials that roads are composed of and the engineering that goes into development of a road has definitely improved, but the average width of a vehicle has remained largely the same. Full-size vehicles have a certain track width, and that's very similar to trucks and trailers and all of these things. They've been standardized for a long time now, way longer than the automobile. And occasionally we see high-performance vehicles that are extra wide, but those come with special taxes because they're larger than the road. And especially like the extras, like the super gigantor, like construction trucks. Those things are very new. But we didn't have giant vehicles like that in the past. In the old days, when they wanted to move a trebuchet or a catapult, they would just clear out the field in front of them to drag it along the way, or they would build them on site. Siege weapons were built on site because you can't drag a siege tower 100 miles. Fucking thing will fall over. First time you have to go over a small hill.
Yeah, Army Engineer Corps and things like that have, obviously been in existence for thousands of years at this point, and that's kind of where logistics are part of operations that many people never understand, and that's why conspiracy theorists are so hilarious because they don't understand the logistics it would take to actually execute some of these conspiracies. And that's where again it's like when you're talking about coordinating people to build a trebuchet, the logistics in that alone are so complicated and complex that it's not obviously not too complex to get done, but the whole reason we understand empires having existed in their fashion is because the people that were able to coordinate that type of complex activity were the ones that effectively wrote the history books for that time. And that's why it's like coordination between humans is so difficult on a small scale that when you start trying to scale it up to some of the level of these conspiracy theories where the stuff that we know as conspiracy fact got exposed simply because humans are not good at keeping secrets, and that's where I feel like over time 99% of the conspiracies that happened are going to be exposed just because the people involved are, you know, gonna want to have their shit acknowledged, whether it's not in their lifetime or not. And that's kind of where, you know, humans have this need to, if they pull something off that's a great accomplishment, they want people to know that they did it, and that hubris is kind of the self-defeating element of conspiratorial secrecy that, you know, we know about the Borgias, and we know about you know, all these historical families that influence stuff because they couldn't keep their shit secret.
Man, people want to be acknowledged for their mediocre accomplishments.
Right.
So it's you know what? Actually, I'm actually really pleased that the number of conspiracy theories have gone up, because that means that there is this overwhelming rise in the quality of general optimism within a population.
Right,
If
yeah.
people are willing to, if they're willing to entertain not just one but multiple, and some are really odd. Like apparently, there's a conspiracy theory that Socrates didn't exist, that he was created by the people that would have been his students, so that they would have had a straw man to you know, give credit to in case the ideas were rejected.
I mean, that's not out of the realm of possibility.
Oh, no, I know.
That, you know, somebody like Homer is a mythical figure in history that is still debated whether he existed or not. So, you know, I'm not going to put more stock in Socrates than Jesus just because more people believe in one or the other. To me, it's like there is more historical evidence that Socrates existed, but I'm not going to put out the realm of possibility that he was a ghost, because hell, Bruce Beckswalter doesn't exist, but in like fucking 100 years, people might think he does just for whatever reason.
And then they'll figure out that Bruce is the name of my dog.
We'll also consider the amount of information about various civilizations that existed over thousands of years that has occasionally just been destroyed outright by other civilizations. And a lot of these conspiracy theories, or a lot of these ideas that tend to fill up gaps in history or gaps in understanding about the reason why various structures even exist, isn't as easily characterized. The information isn't as easily characterized simply because it was taken out of the realm of public access, either by an invading nation or through an accident. and our record keeping abilities now, or at least over the past 100 years, have become increasingly more easily preserved or more securely preserved.
And in the last 50 years, last 20 years, our record keeping ability has become so profoundly incredible that it's recording useless information like clickbait. And who the fuck cares how many celebrities don't look anything like they do on film because they've got, you know, a dedicated makeup and hairstylist who's on set the whole time they're there, making sure that they look just like their character.
Yeah, because in our capacity to record information, we've also expanded our capacity to trick the camera, trick audio, and exploit the information channels themselves to push out information that is meant to look real but not actually be real. So God forbid most of the stuff that goes down in the history books about now is not accurate. You know, who knows how many things that get documented about now, even from what are considered to be firsthand sources, will actually accurately represent what's happening now.
You brought up something that's really, I think is really important. There is so much information being produced now, and also we have a lot more historians being generated by our academic systems. So there might be a balancing there, but there's still a lot of people who are generating information and a lot of people that have to filter the information. And then in 20, 30, 50, 60, 100 years, there's still going to have to be a lot of people who go back and try and piece it all together. And at a point, it becomes unmanageable because you'd have to have complete divisions that might never see some other portion of the information, so they wouldn't get they wouldn't get a clear picture anyways. And then it has to rely on somebody else to dissect multiple reviews to bring out one overarching review. At a point, our history becomes so obfuscated just by the sheer volume of data that it's not accurate anymore.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons we need to analyze it in the flow.
Yeah.
And not get too disconnected from it to try to analyze it. Because, for example, one of the things I'm seeing now is the evolution of the display of elitism. And in that, what I mean is capitalism was heavily based around displaying classes, and in that the elite class was obviously meant to be the most desired and most affluent looking but least attainable class. But now that the display of that class has been restricted by lockdown, for example, with the Hamilton play or a musical, so many people were limited in their access to seeing the Hamilton musical because it was only on Broadway and you only had access to it. They were going to do that for like 4 or 5 years or however long, and then they were going to have it tour America, and then there was going to be the second tier of non-elites who were like getting into Hamilton in the second wave because now it's off Broadway and now you can go see it at your local theater, but only people who are in the local bourgeoisie are going to go see that. And then once it finally came to TV 7 years later, then everybody was going to get to experience Hamilton. But now because of COVID, they had to skip all that and go directly to video. And now the cycles are all thrown off. So now you have people trying to like, there's people who are not going to watch Hamilton for like 2 or 3 years because it's a cultural phenomenon that on multiple levels tried to get into the social psyche, but at the same time, because of the way that the social psyche work, there's always pushback. But even then, because the caste systems are being redistributed and how they express themselves, people are trying to figure out if they're bourgeoisie if they watch Hamilton, or if they're still going to be able to claim working class if they watch Hamilton. It's really crazy to watch. Like, are working class people allowed to enjoy Hamilton, or do you have to watch it and hate it because it was something that was meant for the upper class elite before, and now that it's accessible, do you have to hate watch it? This is where I'm not even necessarily, I don't care about musicals, so I'm not even going to watch it because musicals are a cultural phenomenon that I have no interest in. I'm not going to watch Cats. I'm not going to watch fucking Rent. I don't fucking care about musicals. I hate musicals. That's just not my thing. But I analyze the shit out of them because they're culturally relevant.
So, instead of a musical, because I just see as a musical as a highly Americanized, modernized opera. When I was in middle school, one of my teachers said, we're going to the MAC today, the Musical Arts Center at IU, and we're going to watch a performance of a ballet. And he asked the class how many people, this is a small class, it was like 20 something people, but he asked the class, how many of you have been to the ballet before? And I raised my hand, and I think like 3 other people raised their hand, and 2 of which were girls that rode the school bus with me, who I knew were actively involved in ballet. And then the other person was, I can't remember who, a handful of people though. And so we all went, and it turns out the entire class went to see this performance. So is somebody still working class if they've been to the ballet?
It depends on which performance, because if it's the Nutcracker Suite, then yes, because everybody gets access to the Nutcracker Suite. But if it's something that's only being performed at an opera house in Russia, then no. If they've gone to that ballet, then no. And that's this is where that dichotomy of what you get access to, the first time kids go see Shakespeare in America, it's probably for a middle school play, or not a middle school play, but a middle school field trip, and they'll probably see something like A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah, I was gonna say Midsummer Night's Dream.
What's the other one?
Romeo and Juliet.
Might see Romeo and Juliet. Yeah,
Hamlet.
I was gonna say it probably won't be Hamlet or Macbeth necessarily, because that shit is too complex for teenagers.
It won't be Hamlet, Macbeth. You might see Much Ado About Nothing.
You might see Othello.
Maybe
as a teenager, maybe.
I was actually in elementary school, and we did a performance of Hamlet at a civic arts center that was pretty heavily attended by people of all backgrounds.
Yeah, you got to realize that's not normal. That's not normal, right? Like, I went to a private school. That's not normal. I'm not going to sit here and act like the experience at a private school is normal. And that's where, at the same time, like, I know there's a general level, because you'll go to some field trips where there's public school, private school, and township school kids, and then there's some field trips where there's only private school kids. Like the Civic Arts Center thing, that was probably all private school kids. Like,
no, it was a public school performance.
What city are you talking about, though?
Oh, so this was a Blue Ribbon School in Southern California.
That's what I'm saying. Because when you talk about like Carmel, Indiana's public school is better than some places private schools because of the redlining and the way that the rich people have all gathered into one place. So then the municipalities have articulated some public schools are on the level of private schools, but it's only in white areas. So when you talk like, this is like, again, in Southern California, I'm assuming if it's a small town, it's probably heavily white in that there's maybe some, representative kids in the keeping the quotas, but that's not the normal case for like most public schools across America. Like, that's just not the case.
It's a pretty on target representation. We all essentially acknowledged it. At least those of us who were aware enough to really take into account the demographics. And I was on the lower end of the, I suppose, the perceived income ladder, despite the fact that I passed for white. But there were a lot of representative, not a lot of representative students who were
token
black
students. They were percentage, the quota.
Yeah, definitely, it was a percentage. But it was also an area where there was a high concentration of wealth as well.
Mm-hmm. And that's, again, I've been to that school. So I know that, there's some schools where you learn Macbeth and and Hamlet in elementary school, but that's not America. That does not represent America at all. And that's where you in your experience have to get outside yourself to be like, I know in my experience, every kid didn't have like access to a Mac lab in first grade. Like we had a full-on Mac lab in first grade where you get an hour almost each day with your own computer, but that's not America. And every kid in first grade didn't get that. Every kid in first grade doesn't get that now, let alone in the fucking early 90s. So I'm not, it's crazy. I think when people hear me talk, they might assume I come from a specific background, but it's crazy how affluent the people I grew up around are because my parents put me around those people for the sake of being like, okay, there's this is one side, and then they take me to like the Wheeler Mission and be like, you need to serve food to homeless people, so you don't think that everybody's in this. And that's where it's like there's a sense of there are a lot of different Americas, and when you grow up in a certain caste, you may not realize you were in the upper caste because you felt like you didn't have a income for your local area because you were looking around seeing millionaires and maybe a couple billionaires. But now you can look back and be like, oh yeah, everybody didn't have Ferraris in their neighborhood or Ferraris pulling up to their school. Like, I'm sure the school you went to had at least one Porsche, at least one Mercedes in the park. Like, when the parents pulled up, that didn't happen at every school.
Oh, sure.
You know
There was plenty of material wealth that was being flaunted or accrued. I mean, one of the things that my family got when we interacted with other families was, oh, where do you live? And we would say where we lived, and then they would come back with something like, oh, we live at the top of the hill and you live at the bottom of the hill. And like, they would live in the new housing development of like the McMansions that cost, $600,000 to live in, that, eventually all burned down due to a brush fire in the area, which was pretty unfortunate. A lot of people had to evacuate, and there's no schadenfreude there or anything, but
They should have paid their
it just shows the
groundkeepers
sheer
better.
impermanence of material wealth when you're just applying, when one is applying themselves to cosmetic accrual.
Mm-hmm. And it's super dangerous because then those people that grow up in that environment think that shit is equivalent of making an impact in the world or being successful. And really, it's the most selfish shit you could possibly do, and the most non-impactful. Like, nobody, all those people that were in those McMansions, nobody's listening to those fucking people's podcasts right now. Nobody's gonna remember any of those fucking people in the future because none of them actually did shit. And that's the craziest part with all these people who build this material wealth that they then only focus on their family, where it's like, yeah, that's good to enjoy, but when you disappear off the face of this planet, all that shit disappears with you, and you made no impact on our species. Good job. No impact on our species whatsoever.
Is that even part of, the metrics of a successful life anymore? Leaving a positive impact, or helping to develop a community, helping to improve a community, making the world better for the future, making the load less stressful for future generations.
I think that's all kids today are going to care about, but because the generations before us, leading up to us, were so disconnected from that, they're still around, they still are going to go to their graves condemning all of those things you just said as anti-success, when I think this is why I'm so optimistic about the future, because all these kids are growing up with those things as their main metrics of success. Like the Greta Thunbergs, Greta Thunberg comes from wealth, but she cares more about changing the fucking planet than how much is in her bank account as a kid. It's crazy.
She cares
Greta
so
Thunberg
much.
has made more as a kid than a lot of adults will ever make in their lives. But that's not why she's important, and that's like the least, least amazing thing that she's done in her life.
She was so successful at raising awareness that she became hated by adults in America. Hated. Like
adult men,
yeah.
Mostly adult men. Let's not act like there's a bunch of women out there hating on Greta Thunberg, because there's not.
I bet there were some who were like pretty silent about it, but yeah, it's overwhelmingly disproportionately adult men who rallied. They
are picking on a teenage,
an autistic girl.
They're supposed to be men, and they're wasting energy on the internet picking on a teenage girl. And that's supposed to make them feel manly in this country, apparently. That's like an exercise in bonding that was going on for months. And it's, it'll probably resurge whenever she gets back in the public for something. But there's months where you had people who are supposed to be identified as adult men wasting their time bonding together, hating on a teenage girl. That's and then they'll get mad at the term toxic masculinity, as if that's not the best definition of that type of behavior. What else can you call that? A bunch of dudes getting together on the internet to hate on a teenage girl for trying to save the planet. Like, what other... You can only come up with some disgusting words for that, because that's disgusting behavior.
I saw an attempted dissection of toxic masculinity, and the point was that anything that only men like can't be entirely good. And it was really kind of focusing on, the hyper masculine culture. I think we used to call it machismo, but I feel like that's even more nuanced than toxic masculinity. But the point basically was, there are all these examples of things that only men like, and I think one of them was Joe Rogan. And so the dissent is there's no good can come from something that only men like.
Yeah, I think his audience is something in the 90 percentile, like something in the 90s, all like men.
Yeah.
So I want to say over 9 out of 10 of his audience is men, or at least it used to be. But it's overwhelmingly white too. His audience demographics are really crazy.
Yeah, let's see. As of April of 2019, it was 91% male guests.
Okay.
Let's see.
Oh my God.
Joe Rogan and the women that love him.
Jesus.
Here's an article that I am scanning for a number, and I don't see a number anywhere. Yeah, almost all of his guests are men. This article doesn't even say which women appeared on his show.
Well, Dr. Rhonda Patrick's one that's...
Okay, that's one.
Good, yeah. She's like one of the good guests that he has on ever so often. But I think most of the women end up being comedians.
Here's some numbers. They have data for 1,128 episodes, which had male guests, and there were 68 guests that were female. That's not even 1%.
Out of 1,000?
Yeah, over 1,000.
Oh my God.
So
Jesus.
So we're talking like 99% male guests. And granted, this is a really brief, cursory glance at the internet. I'm not like going to dig into this and try and find, all of his female guests. And that's not even the point. The point is that there's a culture of things that only men like. I think that I'm not sure if there's a culture of things that only women like. I'm sure there's a man-hating society. No, they probably allow men to be in that too, and they probably like being whipping posts. Or they're LGBTQ qualify for something in that range that probably have a strong dislike, but they probably have a strong dislike for a certain type of man and not just men.
Do you know the word off the top of your head without Googling it?
Uh,
It's so like unused in our society.
misandry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where again it's like our society just doesn't even barely use that word because the idea of women gathering together to hate on men, it's like it's blasphemy in America, you know?
No,
they
like,
wouldn't even allow that.
you know, I'm glad that you asked it like that because I wouldn't have, my brain wasn't headed towards misandry at all, even though I was essentially defining it. That's
Right.
That's the
Exactly. You defined it without using the word because our culture, it just doesn't use the word that much.
that just makes me mad at myself.
No,
No,
again,
I'm not. I mean, I'm
it's you know, think about I because the whole reason I asked it that way is because think of how many movies you can think of that have misandry as a subject.
you know, I was gonna say Thelma and Louise, but I don't think that that's actually a good
Barely.
example. It's barely an
No,
example.
it's like that's like self. They take it out on themselves.
Yeah,
then.
no, that's what I mean. It's like initially that's what popped up in my mind, but it really wasn't because they were running from the potential threat or the threat of potential punishment. They weren't even there. There hadn't been time for any. Well, I guess they just killed him. They didn't. There was no rape charge or anything like that. And during that culture of when was that? The 80s or the 90s? Anyways, during that culture, that wouldn't have been investigated. They would have. Was it Thelma? Thelma would have gone to jail for shooting the rapist. Or was that Louise? I can't remember which one was which.
Yeah, and that's the crazy part. That's not even. Nobody remembers that part about the story.
Yeah.
That's like the least remembered element of the story in that
Everyone
today, that shit would be a revenge fucking. Ain't nobody driving off the edge of a cliff at the end of that. They're driving over that motherfucker at the end of that movie.
Yeah,
like in 2020.
That movie literally takes place in the time span of getting to the bar, meeting the guy, the event, and then subsequently killing him and dragging him out into the parking lot and continuing to beat his dead corpse.
Yeah.
And then
So there are a lot of. Sorry, go ahead. I interrupted.
I was gonna say again. I think in that today, it ends with them driving over his dead body and not driving off a cliff because that's where, you know, that movie almost pushes the revenge back in the closet of saying, oh, if you try to lash out, you'll just have to end up driving off a cliff at the end. So you might as well just, you know, keep that anger in your head.
What an incredible metaphor. By seeking to run from revenge, you are destroying a classic car by driving it off of a cliff. You are a classic car being driven off a cliff if you seek revenge. Women can't seek to save themselves even from something like that because they are essentially, you know, they're turned into a classic convertible. A cherry red classic convertible, priceless in its own right, off of a cliff to be destroyed. That's their life that's being destroyed.
Thelma and Louise 2020, they drive around in a classic car starting fucking riots all over the country and like destroying fucking prisons because they're burning down the prisons full of rapists. And then it's like, that's a completely different movie that in 2020, it's like, men would riot and try to get that shit. Well, a certain type of man would riot and try to get that shit taken out of the theaters before it even makes it.
Thelma and Louise 2020. Thelma and Louise are a pair of civil rights lawyers who stumble upon a secret cache of unprocessed rape kits and proceed to pay for the testing of the said rape kits, and then it turns out that half of the rapists are police officers.
Yeah, that's what I've been saying. We need to cross-examine those unprocessed kits with all the DNA of all the police officers out there 'Cause even if it's just one hit, it would be worth it.
Yeah.
And all the good cops should not care. All
Yeah.
the good cops should not care if we do that. So
No, that shouldn't be a
that's
problem.
just something that we need to do as a society. Even if it has to come from a movie about it, maybe we need to make that film to get that concept out there or some shit, or a short.
Yeah.
But people need to start looking at these fucking police officers and being like, hey, what are they actually doing for society? Because, god damn it, I don't feel protected by them right now. If anything, they're a threat in their current incarnation, and that's why it's like... Sorry, go ahead.
There's a video circulating of police officers pulling over a woman and detaining her very forcibly, and it's on the audio from his body camera. It turns out that she apparently like hit him or spat at him or threw a bottle at him at a protest. There's like revenge being perpetrated by law enforcement.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
And I think that it's extra important to just refer to that entire culture of law enforcement as law enforcement, because that's what needs to change. That culture needs to change. If we make it about individual bad cops and say the good cops won't care if justice is sought, then it's sending a really mixed message that we only want that it's not the culture that's the problem, that it's individuals that are the problem. But it's definitely the culture that promotes that kind of an individual and allows their actions to exist.
I'm gonna start calling them the Blue Mafia.
Blue
That's
Mafia.
all they are. Is they're a bunch of extortionist thugs.
Yeah.
At this point, if they're not willing to stop killing people under the threat of having their money taken away, they're fucking mafia. That's all they are at this point. That's all they are. If we have black people who are being killed in the streets, while there's a white guy who killed a fucking cop and injured another one in the last 2 weeks and got taken in alive. But you have black people being killed by cops in the street over a fucking fraudulent check that wasn't even real. Like, man, fuck the police. That's all I gotta say about that. Fuck the police. I'm so tired of the cops. Like, at this point, they do nothing good. They do nothing good. There's all these other services that help people who are mentally ill, that help people who are actually victimized. Cops don't stop fucking violent crimes. They just come in and further victimize and traumatize the people who got victimized in the first place. That's all they ever do. They don't stop fucking violent crimes. I'm not going to sit here and act like I care about cops trying to stop violent crimes, because that's not what they do.
What kind of violent crimes even happen anymore that don't involve some federal agency?
Right. That cops stop. That cops actually stop.
Well, I think that they send them in eventually. But yeah, no, I think you're right.
Up. And that's what I mean. It's like, again, the way that their response, they're always so far away from the crime that their response time is always clean up. That's all the cops do. They're just glorified people who clean up crimes and then harass people on the clock. They get paid to harass fucking lawful citizens and frame us for crimes that we're not committing, so then they can say we're resisting arrest and then potentially kill us on the fucking street.
Yeah.
That's what they do. That's what they get paid to do.
Yeah.
So fuck those people. Defund all that shit. As far as I'm concerned, and let's rebuild how we fucking deal with crimes. Because right now, the cops don't deal with crime.
Well, I think that it's important that, the police aren't going to solve the crimes that really have long-term impact on society. They're not going after multinationals. They're not going after fucking Nestle that buys up water rights in California, even though it's in the middle of, decades of drought conditions.
They're not going after Epstein. They're not going after Maxwell.
Oh,
so all
fuck.
these people are like, it's crazy.
A judge just ordered that the Epstein documents be destroyed.
Yeah, Yeah, because the cops aren't trying to fucking.
They're not going in for
to.
that. And so we've got corporations that are able to pollute the environment on a massive scale, and there is no oversight or no attempt to get them to actually pay for what they're doing. They provide some like meager monetary amount, and they penalize an executive, but it's barely anything. They don't feel it. They might have to move to a different department, or they might have to move to a different division of their company, but they're not just, they're giving golden parachutes too, like the financial guys that fuck everything up. But the police don't go after them. And what's worse is that money's insured. So even if a business or a bank or whatever loses a big chunk of change, they get their money back. But somebody who's speeding because they need to get someplace on time and traffic is terrible and they've got they're just running late. They've got a few issues that they're trying to contend with, and they're running late. They get pulled over, and that takes like half hour, 45 minutes, an hour out of their life, and then they definitely are late. And then they might lose their job.
They might have to pay a full or half month's rent.
Yeah.
For being late.
Yeah. And then that doesn't actually help anyone. That actually damages the local economy.
Yep.
So
yeah, fines don't help. They only keep poor people poor.
Yeah.
Fines do not affect rich people, and then they only help to keep poor people poor. So that's where there's a few things that we need to re-examine as a society in order to get to this point where we don't just do things because our parents did them or our grandparents did them, and then we actually examine constantly if the things that we're doing are good or not, so we can then change them. Because it's like, if we change into something that's not good, we need to change from that. And I think there's just this culture of, even if it's not perfect, if it's a solution, we sit on it, and that's how we move forward. That worked it didn't work for our parents, but they thought it worked. But we can't do that moving forward as a society. And I think, again, I don't think the kids are going to want to do that at all. So that's where I have optimism about the future. But it's just going to take all the people who were born in the early 1900s to get out of the political system.
Yeah.
Is what it comes down to.
Well, in regards to the cultural implications of current generations and the generations that will follow, and the political decisions of previous generations, and essentially, the term is boys' club or men's club. It's a reflection of the power of the patriarchal structure that has held much of the cultural influence in this country, essentially since its inception, because there weren't any women who were involved in the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and women didn't even have the right to vote until essentially a blink of an eye ago. And there are still systems in place that prevent women from accessing the same levels of wealth and influence that men are able to access. And if you talk about the fact that there are so many untested rape kits, if women really had any sense of cultural or societal or moral equitable input into the direction that a culture evolves, then such a thing wouldn't even be allowed to exist. Because there are men who are the victims of sexual assault as well, but there's this element of stoicism that goes along with essentially trying to ignore the victims of sexual assault. And if there is an opportunity to grow out of that and to make a more critical examination of the rights of women essentially in the country, then I think that there would be a more broadly accepted movement towards equitability across the board.
Well, I think part of it has to do with just representation of equitability in that um, man, I go back and watch some of these old, not even old, some of the stuff from the early 2000s and even early 2000s, women are just sex objects. They don't really have any agency in media. So I think we it's really, again, it's really difficult for people to see the the water when they're in it as fish. But when we try to look around and examine what's happening around us, we get better at being aware of the tropes and stereotypes that are thrust at us so we can avoid taking them into our psyche unwillingly. But there's a lot of shit that I think people just haven't looked at, that they've taken in the past as really, really damaging shit towards our capacities to view women with agency. Even, even down to like Deanna Troy is a really damaging character because that character reduces the capacity of women to, it's like her function in that role was so reduced to a gender role that was reinforcing society's greater view of gender roles, that now looking back on it, I'm like, oh, the way they portrayed her in Picard is way better because it's not as one-dimensional as a character, and she actually has agency now. So it's, as an adult, it's easier for me to analyze the shit that I watched as a kid, to be like, oh yeah, these things about it are bad. I'm not going to cancel it, but I still can watch it and understand that, ooh, these things about this show are not good, and are also things I need to address to make sure I don't accept them in other forms of media.
It never actually occurred to me that just how much potential damage there was for the Troy character. When they first introduced her, she was the only one that had that giant check out my rack Starfleet uniform. She was still dressed like somebody that wasn't a part of Starfleet.
Yeah, she didn't have the rack at first, and then they gave it to her and dumbed the character down even more, because even before they brought out the rack, the character was kind of useless, but when they brought out the rack, it was like even more useless, because if you look at the other women characters, they had the head of security, and then they had the head of medicine, and then we bring in this other woman whose job is to feel and give us information that everybody already understood in the first place, and then they bring out her tits. And then that's what her character is. Tits and useless information for like 4 seasons, and then they covered the tits back up. Where you're like, okay, this is like the way I described that character is exactly what it was. And I hate that about the series, that character exists. I shouldn't have to describe a character on Star Trek in that way, but that's what they did to that character. That's the nicest way to describe that character, because it's really worse. It's one of the most useless characters, but they kept her there to sexually objectify her. Her character had no function but the cleavage for like 4 seasons. And that's sad. I love Discovery because that character doesn't exist on Discovery. I can't think of one character that I can point to that's that character. That's a useless woman to be there for her cleavage. Because that woman exists in 90% of media in the 90s and about 100% of media in the 80s in some form. And that's where I'm like, we've come a long way for representation, but we still, obviously, you can't stop demanding better representation from the people that are willing to do that shit into the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Because that's why we need more. There just needs to be more public influence on the way these things are developed, because then we just wouldn't have these problems.
It's even worse because it also just occurred to me, her mom was like hypersexualized and also, able to read people's minds and tell people what they were feeling and what they thought and all those things. She was, in a lot of ways, they created this it's like a homunculus in a sense. It's this thing that's, or maybe that's the wrong term. Deanna Troi and Loxana were both like these objects of perfection. They were clairvoyant. They could read your mind. A woman that can read your mind and is beautiful and is hypersexualized and hypersexual. Like, what a crazy space fantasy.
And even down to then they had her get mind raped by that one species.
Yeah.
Which is like, they didn't have to do that storyline except for the fact that they were just reveling in her sexuality for the sake of what they thought was the audience that needed that.
Yeah.
And it's like, that storyline did not need to exist except for the fact that the writers were a bunch of dudes.
They were taking advantage of her character.
Yep.
They took advantage of that situation by creating a character who could even experience something like that. I'm sure. Yep. There was somebody on the writing team who thought it was a good idea. Like, yeah, we're gonna help change people's minds about objectification. But all they did was create an episode that was extremely traumatic for the character and the audience.
Yeah, because they even did that. It came at a point where when you're trying to give the character more depth, removing her agency even more is not the way to do that. And that was their path to making Deanna Troi more multi-dimensional. It's like, oh, yeah, it's just, again, that's why now that we have Discovery and you have a series that is unabashed about empowering women to say, hey, if people have phasers, your upper body strength is kind of taken out of the picture. Like, it doesn't matter if someone has stronger upper body strength, because then you have an android who's stronger than our entire species anyway. So if a door gets stuck that needs to be opened, we're not going to expect just a man to open it. It's going to be an android or some shit. And even then in Discovery, you have super strong android women now. So it's like, we had a perceived equality before, and we're getting closer to actual equality and equity now. Because now when you compare Discovery to Next Generation to the original series, oh my God, in 60 years, we've come so far, or 50 years, however one you want to count it.
No, it's
We've
true.
come so far in our representation just by looking at Star Trek.
Well, Picard is now a frail old man that, well, not by the end of the season, but he starts out as a frail old man that Starfleet has given up on, that nobody listens to because he made some poor decisions. So
It depends on a guy named Eleanor.
Eleanor.
And then you also have the woman Michael Burnham in
Yeah.
Discovery. So again, they're not
They're
being
not
subtle about
no,
these
they're not.
things.
Well, I think was really fantastic is in Picard they introduced the characters, the Romulan order of female warriors who exist solely to kill the Tal Shiar.
Right, yeah, because that's where Eleanor was trained in
Yeah.
that he's the outcast male, and he's like the weakest one.
But
So
he's
Picard got the fucking
but
outcast
he's
from the
still a
women.
formidable fighter though. That's what
Oh yeah, yeah.
that's what Picard's friend is like because they have the whole what's the candor? They have that name for their full candor or whatever it is. The no lies, just be honest, and everything will be easier type situation. Full candor, maybe. Anyways,
Yeah.
but she says that he's a formidable warrior, that he's like extremely skilled with the sword. So she gives him props. She just admits that he can't ever be a part of the order because he's male.
Yep. Which again, they're not being subtle about turning these tropes on their head, and then in the process, even breaking down why those things are bad. So.
Yeah.
They go to an extreme now where we can say, oh yes, there is a danger in trying to be too equal if you don't even understand what equality actually means, and how some people are now, using the term equity in addition to equality because, you can't have one without the other in reality.
We also need to start adding equitability to that metric. I think that equitability is the next stage after equity is achieved, and then after that we can start to actually dismantle the systems that maintain inequality or inequity or inequitability. Those things will all come down in series, I think. I don't think that I think that we have to address equality. We have to address inequality. We have to address inequity, and in the process, through the process, we find a better tomorrow. We develop a better society, a better community, a better culture that is cognizant and can reflect upon the mistakes that we've built society on. And not just that, but acknowledge that maybe we can do things better.
Well, and that is one of the things that the previous generation doesn't want to do, because then that acknowledges that they made mistakes. And that generation just is not good at owning responsibility for the bad things. They'll take all the credit for the good shit, but none of the responsibility for the negative. So I'm not sure. Sorry, go ahead.
So at that, the previous generation seems to have this ingrained tendency to, at least some segments of the population, or some of the most vocal segments of the population, or the ones that have the most influence or are listened to most often, seem to have a tendency to shift blame or to direct blame and even hold grudges against generations that come after them, in order to...
Hey, what was that thing? What was that? You remember the other night? It was after the Thursday evening edition. We ended up talking about polio for about, God, I felt like an hour maybe of just polio, where we were talking.
Yeah.
So, if I recall correctly, you pointed out that it took some like 44 years after it was actually discovered what it was for a treatment, a vaccine to be developed. And that wasn't even the only vaccine. There were multiple vaccines developed. But for 40 years, you said something along the lines of public schools, public pools, libraries, business districts, industry had to shut down in a rolling fashion. It's kind of similar to what's happening now, but that lasted for 40 years.
Right. So there was a certain level of technological and medical knowledge and advancement at the time. And in the first half of the 1900s, so that would be the first half of the 20th century, polio was identified as a seasonal occurrence, or a seasonal affliction. There would be like polio seasons, and public pools, play areas were shut down out of fear for spreading polio. And it took until I think around 1935 for the first polio vaccine to be developed. But the most effective vaccine, I think, was developed by Dr. Salk in the 50s. And that essentially indicates that there was a period of around, yes, 40 years between the initial onset of the polio um, epidemic and the development of a treatment or a vaccine or a preventative treatment that would allow life to essentially take a different cadence. So if we were to extrapolate and consider the development of the vaccines that we're looking at today for COVID-19, and we were to essentially look at what measures are being put in place now, I mean, there's obviously also there seems to be a generational difference in how people are responding to polio and how people are responding to COVID-19. It could also be because people weren't educated well enough or taught about the criticality of what a pandemic was or what the implications of a pandemic are. They're simply shown snapshots in the history books through their educational experience, and they're not necessarily shown what that means from an epidemiological standpoint or taught what epidemiology actually is.
I wonder how many people are alive today that survived the big Spanish flu, the fucking Kansas flu of 1918. I wonder how many of those people are still around and have enough clarity, because that's like 102 years ago. I wonder how many of them are still around and can reflect upon the complexities that emerged as a result of that. And I wonder how many people who were afflicted with polio during the initial epidemic are still around and can talk about it and reflect upon the complexity of how society had to make changes so that people didn't suffer. Because I don't think it's that high of a number. I think it's so small of a number that most people don't even know somebody. I think most people, the only people that anyone knew who made it through the Great Depression would have been their grandparents, and I'm pretty sure a lot of those people are dead or dying, and probably can't remember.
Well, they don't have a microphone put up to their lips to share their experiences. I'm not seeing any candidates or any local government officials look to our elders who survived or people who may be able to share their experiences, share that information broadly. But it seems like there's just a focus on shiny and new. You know what I mean? There seems to be
that's the squirrel culture,
right? It's a cultural inclination to not necessarily look at what the foundations of research are and only look at what's being done currently with the most advanced technologies available, without understanding that without previous information being gathered and without previous discoveries, current advances wouldn't have been possible.
How long have we been fighting the common cold again? 200 years?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be something, because that's where the whole abracadabra thing is supposedly from, right? Where you get a necklace or bracelet and have abracadabra on it, and by the time the word is gone, the cold is supposed to be gone. That's one of the lore I've heard with the word. I don't know if it's true or not, but obviously it's supposed to be so old that again, I don't know if that's even if it appeared in a book or something. But that type of talisman was not uncommon in multiple cultures.
And there are multiple mutations, unique mutations of the common cold. Starting in 1965, there was a virus called B814, and that was cultivated from a boy who had a cold. And that pathogen was described as, quote, virtually unrelated to any other known virus of the human respiratory tract. and the coronavirus has a tendency to mutate. The CDC has 4 currently common cold characterizations of the common cold, in addition to the 3 or the 2 SARS viruses as well. So this goes back a long ways, and there's also one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to come up with a vaccine or a long-term preventative treatment for the common cold is because it mutates at such a rapid rate.
So the Jerusalem Post shared or reported that a Chinese lab has identified 30 different strains of the coronavirus, and I'm pretty sure that they meant of the current version of it that we're looking at right now, the one that causes COVID-19. And then and there's also reports that it's now believed to have originated in Spain. How we've got the ability to communicate across vast distances almost instantaneously, maybe a few milliseconds of latency if it's a slow connection, but I guess it just comes back to the overwhelming abundance of information and people lacking adequate research skills or even the ability to identify what should be called a tabloid, but they look so real, you know.
Well, I think we discussed that with the TMZ when the tabloid starts to get some of the information right, and then the mainstream media starts to have to retract stories more often.
Yeah.
Then
even
it's
the Onion's
even
right
more
occasionally.
difficult.
Even the Onion reports accurately at some point. Maybe
Right,
they
yeah.
might actually be a couple of years ahead of the story when they report it, but they still get it right at some point.
Yeah. You know, and then when a significant portion of people think that Simpsons are predicting the future and not just coming up with likely things that happen in a predictable society, you know, people. It's crazy to me that something that has been running for as long as the Simpsons have don't get more right. You know, like the stuff that they get right, it's fucking. It's a matter of probability. I'm surprised they don't get more stuff right, and that's where, you know, this whole notion of precognition and psychics and all that other shit. Psychics only work in a linear universe that's not a multiverse. And it's like even the best psychic that's a real psychic can't bat 1,000 in a multiverse. So that's where my understanding of science and science fiction leaves me at a point where it makes it really difficult for me to believe a lot of bullshit because I read good science fiction. I think what ends up happening is when you read or watch good science fiction, the people that inform you don't let you walk away believing bullshit. Because a lot of people watch Back to the Future and believe that time travel could work the way that they made out in Back to the Future, not even understanding that time travel would necessitate such a massive amounts of energy that a single lightning strike probably isn't going to do it. Like, and that's where, again, there's just all these things about the way that science fiction has now broken down the notion of time travel, that if you've been paying attention and reading your science fiction or watching your science fiction, Back to the Future looks just ridiculous now. It's a good film, but the whole thing just looks absurd. Even though we're obviously in a point where the whole notion of science, like time travel, is still science fiction and nobody's done it to anyone's knowledge. Back to the Future just looks utterly ridiculous now. Whereas when it came out, it was groundbreaking, mind-blowing shit. And the whole, like, 88 miles per hour, nobody even questioned that shit then. It just made sense.
1.21 gigawatts.
Right. It just made sense. Because, no, you know, there hadn't been enough good science fiction and Michio Kaku's to challenge our minds as regular people to get to a point where we, like, look at things like, Back to the Future now is ridiculous. You know, I think a lot of kids that grew up now having seen Endgame first would think Back to the Future is just completely dumb. But if they saw them in different order, it wouldn't have been as dumb. But you can't see Endgame before you see Back to the Future. It just ruins Back to the Future completely.
I wonder if that's happened to anyone yet. Seen Endgame before, get the Back to the Future, not get the Back to the Future reference, go watch Back to the Future, and then think, well, that was terrible.
I bet every kid under the age of 13, that's they're going to be their experience with it, is they're going to see Endgame before they see Back to the Future. And then they're all like, and that's funny you say it that way, because there's a bunch of references meant for older people that all the kids aren't going to get, that then they're going to go back and learn about and then rewatch it, and then that shit's going to add a new layer. But it's still like, you know, their perspectives forever changed. You know, some kids will never see Back to the Future, which is crazy. But yeah, for some kids, Endgame is their definitive time travel movie. Or Endgame, or I guess Infinity War, or both. Whatever, however you want to say it, but even then, it's not even time travel; it's multiverse travel. So these kids get a fucking multiverse to start with.
Rick and Morty is a multiverse. Rick and Morty is a multiverse cartoon. Star Trek Discovery is a time travel story.
I don't know if Rick and Morty's for kids, though.
No, it's definitely not. Holy crap, it's definitely not a kid's story. We used to get asked by YouTube all the time, is this show appropriate for kids? Like, no, there's nothing violent about it, but it's not really meant for children.
Yeah, we're not showing nudes or anything.
But we're definitely tame compared to Rick and Morty.
Yeah.
That show disintegrates people multiple times. It has hive minds that allow group orgies. Like that's definitely not kid safe.
Oh my God, most definitely not. And then you know, it's crazy what people think is kid safe just because they don't show nudity. Like I just watched Eurovision and I saw people online saying that that's a warm, friendly, you know, wholesome film that we need in these trying times. And I'm like, wholesome, kid-friendly, like half the jokes are about incest. And that's what I'm like, it's crazy if you don't show nipples, people are like, oh, this is kid-friendly. Like that's what 2020 is apparently.
MCU is kid friendly. We've discussed the brutality of that whole visual story. It's like, and I agree with your assessment. At first, I didn't think it was that brutal until you pointed out, like, there's just no blood. If you saw the actual amount of blood that they should be spilling, it would be brutal as it gets. But we don't actually. The only people we really see die are a robot and the bad guys.
Well, and it's crazy that you bring that up again, because like, it on the one hand it undermines their characters, but then it allows you to then have a Loki series on Disney Plus, because it's okay. He just murdered those people off screen. Like, we're getting a fucking Disney series about a serial killing god. Well, that's what Loki is. He's a serial murdering god. He killed like 80 fucking people in the film.
The Mandalorian
is just because we don't see it that it's you know, it's hard to fathom Loki as a bad guy that's not just comic relief, but it's because all the murder happened off screen.
No, seriously, the Mandalorian's about a bounty hunter. It's about a bunch of Wild West killers, and just like MCU, has no blood because lasers and lightsabers cauterize.
Yeah,
The only
there's a lot
time,
of death on there.
yeah, they blow people up, they kill people every episode.
Well, because then even then, it's hard to remember that. Well, I guess it depends on if they're clones or if they're um, uh, mercenaries or indentured servants, because that's where then you see the stormtroopers getting killed, but because they're all wearing the same uniform and it's all desensitized because they're all wearing the same uniform, you're not thinking about these fucking slaves getting killed.
Yeah, that's one of those things that I always find interesting about Star Wars, is that even though slavery is outlawed by the Republic and the Empire doesn't seem to give a shit about slaves because they only care about humans. But even though slavery was supposed to have been abolished in the outer planets, there's plenty of slavery. Anakin's a slave. His mother's a slave. There's slaves still exist by the time we get to Return of the Jedi, because Jabba has slaves, and presumably the entire time.
Wasn't Rey technically one?
Rey was no, I think she was just a whatchamacallit.
Oh yeah,
she was like a junk salvager.
Yeah. So it wasn't full on slavery. She just was basically
in a position of economic uncertainty that would have prevented her from ever having any opportunity to escape that situation.
Yeah. So it wasn't quite slavery, but it was fairly close.
It was like slavery light. It was Greco-Roman slavery.
Yeah, she was basically an indentured servant to that merchant outpost, it seems like.
Yeah. We'll never find the resources to escape without being threatened with death or entering into galactic slavery. Even Han Solo was a slave, and then he left the slave house to become a stormtrooper, and his girlfriend was a slave the entire time, even up to the point that she killed her savior and became the leader of Red Dawn, and then reported to Darth Maul. I think if you're part of any of those syndicates, you're still a slave to whoever's in charge, because they'll just kill you. Mm-hmm. Especially if it's Darth Maul. That dude killed everyone. Well, he didn't kill everyone. Well,
and I think, obviously the slave Leia was the obvious one, but, this gets back to Americans that are not good at subtlety, where it's like, yes, we're dealing with fucking slavery on a galactic scale, or intergalactic scale, rather, in that this was not an apolitical story that's just about lasers whatsoever. This is not apolitical.
It's about lasers, guys, I swear. That's the brilliance of the industrial light and sound, is that they distracted us with lasers and lightsabers and sounds in space. Let's just think about that for a second. You could hear the spaceships in space.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about shockwaves from an exploding planet or star that rattle your ship. Apparently, when a TIE fighter flies by you, it creates enough of a magnetic or ionic change in space that it creates a resonance in the ship that you're in that is similar within any spaceship that the thing flies by. And it's audible to the audience.
Oof.
Obviously, that can't happen. Man. That can't happen. Obviously, that's screwball. But big ups to the Empire for creating such a loud vessel.
Maybe they had the biggest subwoofers ever known to man.
I have this really oddball theory that the Death Star itself is in fact a giant subwoofer. And it has so much power that it causes entire planets to shake. It's so powerful that it creates lightning. Like that's how badass that thing is.
We need to build that. Let's build that society. Let's build a gigantic subwoofer and call it the Death Star.
I mean, how big does it have to be?
As big as it can.
I mean, it's a small moon, right? Oh God, I mean, how much power we're gonna need the power of a small sun. Oh, this is gonna be great. This is gonna be fantastic.
Well, that was random. Exceptional